Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Chow. I will tell you all about Anne in just a moment. Anyway, this is a show, Grace Under Pressure, that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership perspective, as you will definitely discover that Anne Chow is, you do it with the purpose of bringing people together with a greater sense of community. Welcome, Anne Chow.
Thank you so much, Sean. I'm really happy to be here with you and with our LinkedIn community out there all around the world.
Great. I want to tell folks all about you. You are the first woman of color to hold the position of CEO at AT&T Business. You oversaw more than 35,000 employees and 3 million business customers. And you're currently the lead director on the board of Franklin Covey. That's pretty cool. And you serve on the board of 3M and CSX. You teach at Northwestern's Kellogg School, my wife's alma mater. And I know you have a daughter at University of Michigan, where I'm located. So anyway, the reason we're here today is to talk about your new book, which is called Leading Bigger: The Transformative Power of Inclusion. And it comes out in September. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you so much. And thanks for this opportunity to talk about something, John, that is so close to my heart, and that is leadership.
Well, great. Well, you are quite known. I've known of you and your work for quite some time, so it's my honor to be out here. And I'm going to throw you a curveball right away. So you might want to interview and end the interview right away. No, kidding. The title of your book is Leading Bigger, but you have a wonderful section in your opening chapter, introduction to the book, about the risks of leading smaller. And I often love the concept of defining something by what it is not. What does it mean to lead smaller, Anne?
Yeah. So, I think this whole notion of bigger versus smaller, John, right, it very much applies to leadership, right? And when we think about leading small behaviors, we would reflect on perhaps bosses that we've had that were very narrow focused, people who were micromanaging, folks that focus only on one metric, typically financial, without some of the other critical metrics of businesses, which might be customer satisfaction, employee engagement, revenue growth, right? And so smaller leadership is really about a much more microscopic, narrow, siloed focus lens. I'm sure we've all worked with people who it's very clear that they only care about what they need done for their own purpose and are not thinking about you, let alone all the other people that will be impacted by their decisions, right? So leading small is almost literally that, not having a broad perspective, not thinking about the consequences of what you're doing, being incredibly transactional in your nature, and quite frankly, being very self-oriented, perhaps not intentionally, but being very self-oriented as opposed to being selfless in a way, right?
Good.
And yeah.
No, it's a perfect setup to the idea of by being small, it's the small-mindedness and the self-centeredness, perhaps, inadvertent or not, and which leads up to your concept. Let's flip it around, and it's your leadership style, because you wouldn't have achieved the success that you did had you not led bigger. So what does it mean to lead bigger?
Yeah. So I have used the word lead bigger with inclusive leadership. I almost use them synonymously. But to me, what leading bigger is all about is it's all about, quite simply, widening your perspective to have greater performance and impact, right? Let me say that again. Widening your perspective to have greater performance and impact. And, some of your listeners may be curious about where I came up with the title. And what struck me was that we are always told to think bigger, right? Especially if we're in a rut, if there's a disruption that's happened in the marketplace, a new technology, a challenge in the workforce, right? A challenge on a geopolitical basis, think bigger. Since we were young, since we were little kids, right? And you live in an amazing college town, that's said by a Michigan mom here, that you probably don't like it that I call it a college town, but it is, right? Where
Oh, it's
people are
very
being
much a
trained.
college town. No problem.
Yeah. Where people are trained to dream bigger, right? Not only think bigger, but dream bigger. But no one's really talked about to this point the fact that you cannot dream bigger or think bigger and bring those dreams and thoughts to reality without leading bigger, right? And so leading bigger and inclusive leadership is simply about expanding your perspectives. Why? Because you want to perform better as an individual, as a leader, as a team, right? And you want to have a bigger impact because all of us, to some level, we want to work on meaningful things, right? And so we want to help people. So that's what leading bigger is all about.
Great. And I love how you describe the power of inclusion as thinking wider and for greater impact and improving performance. Sadly, we live in a world where the concept of inclusion, as it's related to DEI, has become a pejorative. So how do we get past that, Anne?
Yes, John, my goodness, we could do a whole LinkedIn Live on this topic alone. So I'll try to do my abridged version here. So I personally, this may surprise some people, but I personally am not a fan of the acronym. Why am I not a fan of the acronym? It oversimplifies three very unique concepts and topics that are relevant to all of us. I'm going to try to do this quickly. Diversity is simply a reality, okay? The world is diverse. Individuals are diverse when compared to each other. There are no two of us that are exactly the same. And in fact, identical twins are not exactly the same because they don't have the same experiences or skills or thoughts, right? So diversity is just simply a reality and it is ever changing. So you as a leader, as a human, can choose to embrace it, lean into it, or you can ignore it at your own peril, right? So I actually think that conversation is very misunderstood. Equity is simply fairness. It's a set of outcomes that are based on fairness. And so you as a leader have to decide what equitable outcomes do you want? Do you want equal access from all of your employees to have promotional and progression opportunities? Do you want all of your customers, I'm going to say something from the industry that I came from, to have equal access to broadband services because access to the internet is vital to how we live today? Inclusion, and the reason why I chose to write a book about inclusion in a much broader sense, requires action. It requires that we think differently, that we expand our thoughts, that we make different decisions more strategically, much more broadly. It means that we take actions that are different than what we did before. DEI, to your point of being now pejorative, right, and a buzzword, right, and kind of a trigger point in so many ways, has been to date, I think, largely limited and misunderstood to issues of race and gender and representation. And that is it. And I will tell you that diversity, equity, and inclusion and inclusive leadership are so much more than that. And I'm not saying that issues of gender and race and representation are not important, but they are only the tip of an iceberg when it comes to true inclusive leadership and truly leading bigger.
Great. A wonderful description. Thank you. I have this sub-theme that I explore, and certainly related to the topic of grace, is the concept of a workplace as community. And I think if a community is to exist, it must be inclusive. Mm-hmm. So what is and I think I think we echo one another as I read your work. Am I reading you correctly, Anne?
Yeah. So I am a big fan of the power of community, right? And let me peel this back a little bit, right? What we learned as a global society in the global pandemic was that there's nothing more powerful or important than the human connection, right? And when you think about community, that's really all human connection is, right? And I have a couple of foundational leadership beliefs, and one of those foundational beliefs is that every business is a people business. If you're in tech, if you're in healthcare, if you're in education, you are ultimately a people business, right? It takes people to drive a business. It takes people to be the heart and soul of the business. The business does not drive people. And the quicker you realize that, the quicker you realize that it is our job as leaders, right? Leadership is all about people, right? You manage things, you lead people. And so the power of community, whether it's internal to your organization with your employees, right? In my book, I call it your workforce, right? Or external to your organization. It could be your customers, could be your shareholders or investors, could be your listeners, could be your audience, right? Your suppliers. It's ultimately about people. So that sense of community, that sense of connection is vital in order for you to get done what you need to get done in the most effective and efficient ways.
Great. Now, powerful, and I like the way you explore that. And it raises another idea as relate to inclusivity or inclusion, the power of sponsorship and allyship. How does that complement the concept of inclusion, Anne? So
Yeah, so it's a John, it almost seems like you've attended one of my classes at Kellogg, because there's a class that I teach that I actually go through the 4 critical roles that we all need in our careers, but that we as leaders owe it to serve for others. Those 4 roles are allies, coaches, mentors, and sponsors. But let me touch on the 2 that you highlighted. So allies support us. Right? They support, and an ally can be episodic. Hey, you could support me for this project that I'm working on, or you could be a supporter in my life, right? It could be a counselor, it could be a coach, it could be somebody in your church if you have a faith structure that's important to you. It could be somebody in your family, right? We all need allies and supporters and cheerleaders to encourage us along, right? Sponsors are perhaps the most elusive of roles. And sponsors are those who will advocate for us, who will talk about us when we're not in the room, right? With sponsors, they know our performance, they know what we're capable of, they believe in our potential, and they speak up for us. They put their names next to ours, right? Sponsorship and sponsors can only be earned. You can't cold call a sponsor, right? You have to earn their sponsorship. So the role that inclusion plays in both of these is critical, right? And I will say, John, I'll share a little factoid to the group here listening, and that is that leaders, over 70% of leaders, pick proteges of the same race and gender as themselves, right? And why is that? Well, it's because, just as we've talked about and had a lovely, repartee about Ann Arbor and our common passion for Michigan, right, and our many connections to the University of Michigan, we gravitate to that which is the same, right? It's the power of human connection. We are looking for commonalities. We are looking to establish some common ground with which to build a relationship potentially, right? A conversation, a connection. And so it is only natural that when we seek to support others as an ally, when we seek to sponsor others, that we inadvertently gravitate to people who are actually more like us than different than us. And so in order to do so inclusively, we have to challenge ourselves. I'd ask everyone who's listening to this broadcast, ask yourself, who are the 5 people that you sponsor today? And are they reflective of the talent pool you're looking to advance? Are they reflective to how, are they a reflection of how your community is evolving? Or are they more comfortable? Are they more the same, right? And I really think that leadership, I believe that leadership is the one common thread that has enabled and driven human progress since the beginning of the human race. Mm-hmm. And in order to drive progress, you have to have this visceral belief that things can always be better, they can be bigger, they can help more people. And therefore, we should, by definition, want to lead more inclusively.
Well, toward that end, you have three wonderful interviews that I remember in your book. One was General Stanley McChrystal, another with Professor Adam Grant, and a third with Ariana Huffington, who addresses the issue that you just touched on with the hiring practices of the organization she leads, is Thrive. Do you recall what she was talking about, how to seek different points of view? Things. So
yeah. For her, she actively seeks different points of view, and just naturally how she runs her business. And she actually has championed this overall practice and understanding of well-being being in a much more comprehensive way, right? That we as leaders have to think much more comprehensively about our people and not just care about them in terms of how are they doing their job, right? Are they staying busy? Are they productive in their job? But that the key to unlocking their potential is to be really caring for them, right? To be caring for them in much broader ways, which requires that we have to understand and learn about them more, right, as humans as opposed to workers, if you will. She shares that and many other insights in that, in the interview and the conversation that I had with her.
Right. And I recall, because it's the headline of the interview that you did with Adam Grant, he said, if you're not a leader, if you're not being inclusive, and that kind of lays it right on the head there. And so, okay, if I'm advice to a fellow senior leader, so I'm thinking here, well, I've got my proteges or people I sponsor, but yeah, they're maybe like me. Well, if I'm a man, how do I reach out to a young woman? Or if I'm a woman, how do I reach out to someone else different from me? What do I need to be thinking about, Anne?
Yeah. So John, I'll come back to my earlier point about some of the risks about the kind of DEI boundaries, right? Which is, this is so much more than just gender or gender identity, right? That is very, very important, right? And so I would encourage every single one of us to think about perspectives as not only that which is gender diverse, but generation diverse, education diverse, geographical diversity, industry diversity, experience set, right? And it happens to be that if you surround yourself with more different kinds of people, more different than you will by definition, and you have an open mind, let's put it that way, right? Surrounding yourself is insufficient if you're not willing to have a growth mindset and open mind about it. But if you surround yourself with other people, whether it's in your community, you seek them out, or many companies have mentoring programs or connection programs. If you happen to be in a leadership role already, you can work with your HR team, right, to try to strike up and get more involved in things like employee groups that may not necessarily be of your demographic. John, I'll tell a quick story that one of the things that I did at AT&T was I was very active in our incredible network of employee groups. I was very active in the women's groups and Asian American groups for obvious reasons, because those are parts of my part of my identity. But I also joined many others because what I wanted to do was understand the unique needs and challenges of those other communities, whether they were our Gen Y millennial employee group, right? The 50 forward one, I became part of that one relatively quickly, but it really takes a desire to expand your learning and expand your network and your set of connections beyond that which you already have, right? And I think that's something that all of us can do. There are so many opportunities to do so. You can do it in a nonprofit, right? In a volunteer sense, right? To expose yourself to a different part of your community that you particularly care about, right? You can, do missions or things like that, right? You can support other organizations if you want to expand yourself to religious diversity, as a matter of fact, right? But the reality is that this broadening of perspectives can happen on any dimension, right? Because none of us are just one thing, right? You are not just a male. I am not just a female, right? You have a very, very different background. I have a very, very different background. I won't comment about whether we're in the same generation or not, right? But
I'm way past old you. I'm a grandfather. I don't think you're a grandmother yet.
No. Yeah, I'm an old Gen Xer. Right. Yeah. So we find ways to learn from each other. Right. And even as our listeners have heard here, just in a couple of minutes together, we found ways to learn from each other and areas where we have common points of view. Right. And if you put us in a room of random strangers, at face value, that may not have ever been. Right. If we didn't proactively choose to come together. So I encourage anybody out there to just take that first step. I mean, there are so many opportunities out there to connect with different kinds of people. You got to just do it, right? And you will be astounded at the incredible joy it brings when you're learning about other people and other communities, and how much it will expand your perspective.
Powerful thoughts. Now I want to flip it. We've been talking about the responsibility of the leader, and I want to flip it to the employee or part of the workforce that you talk about it. And one of the things that you discussed or topics is proximity bias. And in some ways, with our hybrid workplace or remote, that is a greater issue, but it's also an issue with women and women who have children at home or whatever. how do we deal with that? What's some points of advice would you have for women facing these proximity basis challenges?
Yeah, yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily just women, John. I think it's anybody who requires and desires a more flexible work environment, right? I think one of the most fascinating things about what has occurred over these last 5 years is, before COVID, right? It's kind of like BC and then AC, right after COVID, right? But before COVID, people teleworked, right? There were virtual office people. There were people who were in the office or in the work location, what I call in my book work sites, right? Work spaces versus the workplace, which refers to the overall work environment. So we had that as a matter of existence all the time, right? All of a sudden, COVID happens, and we are all forced into a highly majority hybrid work environment, right? Where we learned different ways of work. Now, fast forward to where we are, and it's a little bit of a struggle, right? You see some companies struggling with, how do I get people back to the office? How do I return to the office? And quite frankly, I don't like those words because it indicates that we're going back to the way it was. What we need to think about is, how do we now utilize physical proximity, togetherness, in-person togetherness to our advantage as a tool, right? Simply because you and I wind up working in the same building, it doesn't mean that we're going to collaborate better together. It doesn't mean that we're going to become culture bearers together just automatically. It simply means that we're in the same place. But there is a generation of leader, right? There is a style of leader. And I would argue that it's a small style of leadership that believes you must be in the office under my thumb in order to get your job done, right? And so I didn't mean to give a thumbs up about that small leadership characteristic.
It's a good thought. It deserves to be accented. Terrific, Ann.
That's right. So what advice I would give to those who are supporting people, as well as those who are the people who need flexibility in the work environment, is you've got to put yourself in an environment where that is accepted, that is culturally what they're willing to do. First and foremost, you got to do your job. Okay. You got to perform in your job. That's table stakes, right? You can't be asking for things that you need if you're not doing your part, right? Which is do your job and do it well, perform well, right? I was working with a client where for their certain group of people, if you made your number, you could work flexibly, right? If you didn't make your number, you had to be in the office, right? So it was kind of an interesting dynamic. They were using it as a carrot and a stick in a way, right? And so for people who need that, who require that, there are plenty of organizations out there who are continuing to evolve and learn about this. I would say, the generation of my children's age, which are Gen Zers, I know many Gen Zers who have this as a requirement, right? They don't want to be 5 days anywhere. They want, 3 days, 2 days in different places. And it's up to us as leaders to really understand, what is productivity really, right? And what is it that we need? I don't think there's a single person who would disagree that in person is better for building deep connection, right?
Sure.
But it is not necessary to get every bit of every job done, right? Certain jobs can be done asynchronously. Certain jobs can be done synchronously, but online, right? Certain things like strategic brainstorming, right? R&D functions, right? Manufacturing, right? Frontline kinds of things need to be done in person, because that's the only way to do it in person, right? Effectively, efficiently, and with quality, right? And so I don't think anybody's debating the fact that there's value to in person. I think we as leaders, bigger leaders, have to work harder at showing why and developing the systems of utilizing presence and proximity to our advantage, not the way it was before, which is the way I learned to lead is we all sit in the same building. I can have team meetings with everybody in one conference room. Those days are long gone.
That's true. And while we're talking about that, because you raised it, it's the generational issues. And in your book, you do a diagram of from silent generation to generation alpha, which is my grandkids. So on the one hand, let me ask a flip side question. Do we make too much or too little of generational differences, in the sense that we are people, we are working for an organization, and we need strong leaders. So what's your perspective on that, Anne? So
I think the answer is both, right? So, John, I would say it's both. We make too big of a deal of it, but yet we don't spend time on the key areas sufficiently where it is an important factor, right? So what I would say is those people who make broad generalizations, right, about Gen Z is too lazy, they're entitled, they're the trophy generation, they got a prize for everything, they don't work hard, right? I would say that that's actually not being fair, right? I don't think that's true at all, right? Or Gen Z is only going to work for companies who have deep purpose and meaning, right? I'm a Gen Xer, and I only want to work for companies who have deep purpose and meaning to me as well, right? So I think we have to be careful of those broad generalizations. The area that I am a wholehearted believer in more deeply understanding generational differences is really comes to the eras in which we grew up. Right? As a Gen Xer, I grew up in the ages where you drank water out of a hose, you were left to your own devices, you'd walk home from school, nobody knew where you were, you'd show back home at dinner time, otherwise you would get, you would incur the wrath of your parents, right? And that's the generation, right? The phone was on a long, squiggly cord, right? You could have
spoken like an AT&T veteran.
Yeah, that's right, right? But as a Gen Xer, I've lived through, personally and professionally, many revolutions of the digital era, right? All the way to now, where we're completely mobile and enabled to do whatever we want, wherever we want, at whatever time we want, right? But Gen Z, right? My children's generation, Gen Alpha, your grandchildren's generation, they grew up in a time where technology means something to them. This is the only way they know how to live. They live in a high degree of real-time communication. Some of it is misinformation, right? They live in a world of high transparency. Nothing is kept secret because it immediately hits social media, right? They don't know of a world where technology is not enabling everything that you do, your entertainment, your banking, your travel, right? Everything is driven and housed in your phone, right? You actually value your phone more than your wallet, because what's in your wallet? There's nothing else in your wallet except your physical government ID, right? And we've managed to, right? All the kids carry their couple of pieces of plastic on their phone, right? So in essence, their phone is both literally and physically their wallet, right? We have to take these things into account, right? Gen Z will not, the younger generations will not tolerate, in the way that my generation did. I'll use proximity. Going to work meant you went to the office, right? Going to work meant you commuted to work because you couldn't get work done at home. You didn't have the tools, the technology, right? Gen Z is like, hey, I can get stuff done anywhere, anytime, as long as you give me the tools, right? If I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna want to interact with people, right? If you're telling me that proximity is important, I'll believe it, but you have to show it to me, right? It's not just gonna happen. I'm not just gonna salute and say, yeah, I like being in the office because I like being in the office, right? And so I think we've got to pay more attention to the environment in which they grew up, which has set the norms for their behaviors, their desires, and their priorities, right? And there is, in fact, difference, right? And that's where I think we need to spend our time focused on, as opposed to these broad generalizations of stereotypes, which I think can be very, very damaging.
Well, we are having a wonderful and absorbing conversation. At least I am. I'm learning. But we're coming to the end. And as you know, Anne, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have something that you would like to share with us? So.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I love, and I'm so grateful, John, that you had me on this broadcast, because grace to me is a very important word. And it is a word that is not often enough used in the context of leadership. So I'll tell you a quick story, and it may be a shocking one. But during COVID, so I got the role that I had at AT&T that I eventually retired out of as the CEO of AT&T Business, $35 billion business, the year before COVID hit, and then COVID hit. In one of the early board meetings that I had to present at, right, it may have even been my very first one in the role. Okay, my father got deathly ill. Right, like deathly ill. We thought that we were going to lose him. He also lived in the area, and you remember the restrictions. All of us remember the restrictions at the time. And I had no choice because I was dubbed as his, as the one primary caregiver. My mother was with him, but as the person who could interact with the medical professionals and whatnot, I had no choice but to be able to go see him and try to help him and get him to the hospital and work through all of that, which meant that I was exposed, right, to the virus potentially and everything else. And it literally happened in the week that I had to give this board presentation. And I was stressed beyond belief, personally, professionally. I was supposed to go in person to the board meeting. And I talked to my CEO about it and said, I'm not comfortable doing that. God forbid we didn't know much about the virus at the time. I also am not comfortable because something could happen to my dad at any moment and I would be in the meeting, right? And he showed me grace. He actually said, Ann, there'll be plenty of other board meetings. You can take this one remotely, right? And for that, I can't tell you the amount of relief that I felt that he enabled me that grace, right? That he understood on some level, and maybe if he didn't understand it, he respected it, more importantly, that I was going through something. He knew that I would be in the job far longer than just one board meeting, right? And that, in fact, I would be in front of the board again. And he enabled me that grace and took off that requirement for me to be there in person, right? And, this is the top guy in the company, right, who made that decision. And for that, I was eternally grateful, right? And I think that, that act is one that I have, strove to emulate with others throughout my career. That's a perfect example of a leading bigger behavior, if you will, right? And so that's an example of just someone who gave me grace in a moment and in a time that was filled with immeasurable amount of stress for so many different reasons. And that's the story that I'll share with you. And we can do that for other people when we realize that every business is a people business. And the most important thing is the power of human connection, right? And that we do our jobs, not because of the jobs themselves. We do our jobs to be able to do meaningful work in the context of leading a meaningful life. And grace plays a role in all of that.
Powerful story, and I loved how you said the boss was, or the gentleman was a tough guy, and tough guys do show grace, as we know from our military folks. But also, it's a powerful story, I will say, of inclusion, because this gentleman knew who you are, your potential, and you're a human being. And you have a world and a life outside, as you have lived your life as a leader, as a mom, and all the other things you have done in your community. So that's the power of inclusivity. And the name of your book is Leading Bigger, the Transformative Power of Inclusion. It's a wonderful book. I know it's available everywhere, but how can we find you, Ann Chow?
Yes, thank you, John. So you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn if you'd like to reach out and follow me. Also on Instagram, but you can find me also on my website, which is www.theannchow.com. So look forward to getting and staying connected.
Great. And Chow, it has been such a pleasure to have speaking to you today. You're a wonderful conversationalist, and with that, we'll be out. So
thank you.